just fascinated by the challenge of what was different and what was specific, but also where were the continuities, and that's why I was terribly interested intellectually in this problem of these state socialist countries, because they asked for answers to a whole range of questions, both in development theory and in gender theory. And so for me, that was the interesting thing. Why was Yemen interesting? Because here was a Middle Eastern country with exactly the same policies that were played out in the Soviet Union. And yet, look at the difference in the effects, look at the difference in the culture, look at the difference in the whole political processes at work. So it was that comparative lens, I think, that's always been a very compelling part of my intellectual interest.
So, what did you feel about the position of women in Yemen?
Well, it was, of course, highly marked by class and status. So you could see that the most impoverished, the most badly treated women were also the Akhdam class, who were almost the caste of ex-slaves who had come largely from Sudan, and who were in some ways regarded as a kind of not quite an untouchable class. So there were parallels there with India. But in general, the position of women in a country like Yemen was pretty poor in terms of rights and choices and ability to occupy a place in the world of their own making. So it very clearly was, one of the most challenging contexts, I think, to do research on gender issues. Yemen in general, of course, has some of the worst human development indicators on women. And you have very early marriages, you have high rates of infant mortality, female mortality and morbidity and so on. So, and here was a country in the south, that for colonial reasons was somewhat separate, had been governed somewhat separately, and which had a socialist party trying to make a difference. So it was fascinating to see if it did, to what extent it did, what was it doing, how effective was what it was doing against this cultural background. Now, of course, you can't easily compare North and South because the North was never colonized, the South was. There'd always been a British presence that trained nurses and had brought women into certain kind of skills. And that did make a difference. To the North. So it was interesting thinking about that colonial legacy and, the sort of impact of a socialist party trying to kind of introduce these the new law, family law, new forms of justice, encouraging girls into education and so on, but within the backdrop of a very sort of patriarchal society.
So did you make recommendations?
Oh yes.
What sort of thing?
Gosh, I've got to dig out that report, but it would be, I guess, to encourage women's skill training. The usual package of improvements within industry, but also more widely in society, and also to pick out some of the things that were working better as a result of government intervention. So, I think it was odd because in the UN Decade for Women, they would fix on a country or a region to do these regional reports or these country case studies. So the Yemen report was selected for evaluation to look at whether, progress for women was happening in these various things. So my report was really part of that UN Decade for Women reckoning, even though it was quite early on, but that was where the funding came from for this kind of thing.
I think you said that your original interest was partly because it was Muslim as well as socialist. Is that right?
Well, it is certainly very interesting, and partly because I was very impressed by reading about Soviet Central Asia and how Lenin had actually sought to transform Soviet Central Asia by liberating women. There's a wonderful book called The Surrogate Proletariat, where women were seen as the kind of substitute for a proletariat in societies that had no proletariat. So I was really interested in this kind of notion and had thought a lot about Central Asia, and indeed went to Afghanistan and also to Central Asia, Uzbekistan, on one occasion, thanks to Essex University supporting my trip. So I was very interested in that sort of encounter between a modernizing socialist state and a Muslim society. And so, yes, so Yemen was interesting, as was Afghanistan and Iraq, actually, yeah.
I mean, how far did you feel that, really sort of fundamental changes in belief and so on were needed for women to be able to fulfill themselves?
I thought it was absolutely essential and probably one of the most difficult things to achieve, but the only real vehicle for that could be education, actually, in a society which had very little access to public media. But these customs and attitudes, as we all know, are very much more deeply ingrained, especially when fortified by religious belief that is very strong. And I mean, the degree to which Aden was different helps to explain why some progress here was made, because Aden, being a port, was more open. You had actually, from in the 60s, a kind of socialist trades union movement. So there were forces of transformational change already taking place prior to the advent of the Yemeni Socialist Party, plus, the role of Arab nationalism was quite strong in this time, and that was itself a modernizing force. I mean, the very first nationalist constitutions in the Arab world were gave women equal rights, at least in theory. They transformed some of the family law. And that was the kind of secularizing nationalism. It wasn't fully secularizing, but it had some secular elements to it. So all of those influences prepared the way in Aden, at least, for some progress for women. Not so much outside Aden, not in the hinterlands. No. Although I must say, the first time I went to Yemen in '77. They did have a national kind of literacy program. They got the Akhdam women organized into schools and educated them. They did things. I mean, you could see that girls were going to school even up in the Hadramaut, which is that lovely mountainous area in Yemen. But when I went back in 1984 and visited some of the same areas, the girls had been taken out of school. Partly this was because of the Saudis, the Yemenis who'd gone to Saudi Arabia, had come back and had taken their wives out of the fields and put them in the home and had veiled them when they went out. So there was a real cultural change that had happened, retrograde in my view, that took place in that intervening period as a result of the kind of influence of Saudi, or the experience of the migrants in Saudi Arabia.
And was violence against women an issue?
Well, it was an issue, but it was not talked about. I mean, violence took the form of revenge killings or honor killings of women. I had a very... this was in the second trip. I had I was on a mission for the UN to look at the kind of health and the health conditions of women, actually, and I had with me a woman who worked in the Ministry of Health, who was a very talented woman, and her life story was astonishing. She had been not educated, but had educated herself, borrowing books from her father. She belonged to one of the very powerful, the two big Hadrami families, big clans. She belonged to one of them. And again, from a powerful family, she actually ran away to Aden when she was in her teens, was educated in a nursing school that the British ran. The parents took out a death warrant on her to have her killed for disobeying orders. She was only saved by a son of the other Hadrami family offering to marry her. So it gives you a flavour of just, how difficult even high-born women could find life in those days. And even, until recently, there was, quite a lot of honour killings and this kind of thing. So yes, it's clearly a very big issue. Much worse in the north, or was much worse in the north, where you had the practice of young girls being married off to very old men, and if they said no, they'd even be put in prison. There was some cases I got involved in the north about that. So yes, a harsh society for women, to say the least.